November 1984, Norwegian Sea, north of Iceland. The Soviet battlecruiser Frunze steams through grey waters, its massive nuclear-powered hull cutting through Atlantic swells. 28,000 tons of steel and weaponry. The second Kirov-class battlecruiser represents Admiral Sergei Gorshkov's vision for Soviet naval power, a surface combatant capable of challenging American carrier battlegroups through overwhelming missile firepower. 20 SS-N-19 Shipwreck anti-ship missiles wait in vertical launch tubes, each carrying a 1,650-pound warhead and capable of Mach 2.5 speed. 96 SA-N-6 Grumble surface-to-air missiles provide area defense coverage. Twin 130mm guns, torpedo tubes, and 3 Ka-27 helicopters complete the armament. Soviet naval doctrine declares Frunze and her sister ships the most powerful surface combatants in the world. 400 miles to the southwest, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier battlegroup maintains station. The Nimitz-class supercarrier displaces 100,000 tons and carries 90-plus aircraft. Sensors detect Frunze the moment she exits Murmansk harbor. An E-2C Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft tracks the battlecruiser continuously from 300 miles away. F-14 Tomcat fighters launch from the carrier deck armed with AIM-54 Phoenix missiles effective beyond 100 miles. The Tomcats establish combat air patrol, maintaining surveillance on Frunze without approaching within range of Soviet air defenses. Frunze's captain knows American aircraft are watching, but can't engage them. The battlecruiser's radar can detect aircraft at moderate ranges, but Soviet doctrine requires positive targeting data before launching SS-N-19 missiles. The missile's 340-mile range seems impressive, but Frunze can't independently acquire targets at that distance. The carrier group controls the engagement from beyond Soviet reach. American commanders decide when and where confrontations occur. Soviet ships react to American initiatives, but cannot impose their will on American forces. This pattern repeats throughout every Cold War confrontation between Kirov-class battlecruisers and American carrier battlegroups. Soviet surface combatants, despite massive size and impressive armament lists, never achieve tactical advantage. American carrier aviation controls engagements from ranges Soviet surface ships cannot counter. The fundamental asymmetry of flexible air power versus fixed missile batteries determines outcomes before combat begins. For the Soviet Navy, the Kirov-class program represented response to decades of American carrier dominance. Throughout the Cold War, American supercarriers operated globally, projecting power far beyond the range of Soviet surface vessels. Soviet naval aviation, based primarily on land or limited to small carriers like the Kiev-class, couldn't match American carrier capabilities. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, commander of the Soviet Navy from 1956 to 1985, believed that massive surface combatants armed with long-range anti-ship missiles could threaten American carriers through saturation attacks that would overwhelm defensive systems. The first Kirov-class battlecruiser, Kirov herself, commissioned in 1980. The second vessel, Frunze, followed in 1984. Two additional ships, Kalinin and Yuri Andropov, completed the class. The design specifications were formidable by any measure. 28,000 tons displacement made Kirov-class vessels the largest non-carrier surface combatants afloat. Nuclear propulsion provided unlimited range. The ships could steam indefinitely without refueling, limited only by crew endurance and consumable supplies. The armament was designed specifically to destroy carrier battle groups through coordinated missile attacks. The SS-N-19 Shipwreck anti-ship missile formed the core of Kirov's offensive capability. 20 missiles in vertical launch tubes could be fired in rapid succession, creating a saturation attack that Soviet planners believed could overwhelm carrier defenses. Each SS-N-19 weighed 15,000 pounds, flew at Mach 2.5 speed, and carried a 1,650-pound conventional warhead or optional nuclear warhead. Range exceeded 340 miles under optimal conditions. The missiles used active radar homing for terminal guidance, theoretically allowing fire-and-forget capability once launched toward target areas. Defensive armament was equally impressive on paper. 96 SA-N-6 Grumble surface-to-air missiles provided area air defense coverage with 65-mile engagement range. The SA-N-6 used semi-active radar homing, requiring the battlecruiser's guidance radars to illuminate targets throughout missile flight. An additional 128 SA-N for Gecko point defense missiles engaged threats that penetrated the outer defensive layer. Twin 130mm guns provided surface fire support and anti-aircraft capability at shorter ranges. Torpedo tubes allowed anti-submarine warfare, though Kirov-class vessels were optimized for surface combat rather than submarine hunting. 3 Kot-27 Helix helicopters provided over-the-horizon targeting, anti-submarine patrol, and utility transport. Soviet doctrine envisioned Kirov-class battlecruisers leading surface action groups that would coordinate attacks on American carrier battle groups. The scenario assumed multiple Soviet vessels, battlecruisers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines would detect American carriers at long range using reconnaissance aircraft, submarines, or satellite intelligence. Once the carrier's position was established, Soviet surface ships would close to missile range and launch coordinated salvos, 20 SS-N-19 missiles, from a single Kirov. Combined with additional missiles from escorts and coordinated with submarine-launched torpedoes and bomber-launched cruise missiles would saturate American defenses. Some missiles would penetrate defensive fire, hit the carrier, and mission kill or sink the vessel. Admiral Gorshkov promoted Kirov-class vessels as revolutionary weapons that would make American carriers obsolete. Soviet propaganda described them as the most powerful surface combatants in the world, invincible except against overwhelming force. The cost was enormous, billions of rubles per ship, consuming resources that the Soviet economy could barely afford. 4 vessels were planned and built, each representing significant investment in the vision that surface combatants could challenge carrier aviation. The reality proved catastrophically different from Soviet doctrine because American carrier battle groups were on static targets waiting to be engaged. They were mobile, sensor-rich, aviation-centric strike groups, optimized for exactly the kind of long-range engagement that Kirov-class vessels attempted. A typical American carrier battle group in the 1980s centered on a Nimitz-class supercarrier displacing 100,000 tons and carrying 90-plus aircraft. The air-wing composition was optimized for both offensive and defensive operations. 24 F-14 Tomcat fighters provided air superiority and fleet air defense, each carrying 6 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles capable of engaging targets beyond 100 miles. 24 FA-18 Hornet strike fighters offered multi-role capability, carrying both air-to-air missiles and anti-ship weapons, including a GM-84 Harpoon missiles with 60-mile range. 10 A-6 Intruder heavy attack aircraft delivered precision strikes with heavy weapon loads. 4 EA-6B Prowler electronic warfare aircraft jammed enemy radars and communications. 8 S-3 Viking anti-submarine warfare aircraft hunted submarines using sonobuoys and magnetic anomaly detectors. 4 E-2C Hawkeye airborne early warning and control aircraft provided radar coverage extending 300-plus miles from the carrier, coordinating defensive operations and providing targeting data for offensive strikes. Escort vessels formed layers of defense around the carrier. 2 Ticonderoga-class Aegis cruisers each carried the SPY-1 phased array radar system capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously and controlling up to 26 SM-2 surface-to-air missiles in flight. 4 Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers provided additional air defense, anti-submarine warfare, and surface strike capability using Tomahawk cruise missiles. 2 Los Angeles-class attack submarines operated independently or in coordination with the surface group, hunting enemy submarines and surface ships. Replenishment ships maintained the battle group's logistics, providing fuel, ammunition, food, and supplies during extended deployments. The doctrine was layered defense with offensive depth. Submarines detected threats at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Providing early warning of approaching surface ships or enemy submarines. E-2C Hawkeye aircraft detected surface vessels and aircraft at 300-plus miles, well beyond the radar horizon of surface-based systems. F-14 Tomcats intercepted bombers and reconnaissance aircraft at 100-plus miles, preventing enemy forces from acquiring accurate targeting data. Aegis cruisers engaged anti-ship missiles at 90-plus miles using SM-2 missiles, Point Defense Systems NATO Sea Sparrow missiles. Phalanx close-in weapon systems provided final defensive layers against threats that penetrated outer defenses. Strike capability was overwhelming. 80-plus aircraft could launch more than 200 weapons, simultaneously Harpoon anti-ship missiles, Maverick Air-2 surface missiles, laser-guided bombs, unguided bombs, rockets, coordination through E-2C Hawkeye command and control meant strikes arrived from multiple directions simultaneously, saturating enemy defenses. Tomahawk cruise missiles from cruisers and destroyers provided additional strike capability from surface vessels, allowing attacks on land targets or surface ships from hundreds of miles away.
The critical advantage was range control. American carrier battle groups detected and tracked enemy surface vessels at ranges where enemy ships couldn't effectively respond. Kirov-class battlecruisers needed to close to within 340 miles to launch SS-N-19 missiles, but American carrier aircraft could engage from 400 to 600 miles, depending on mission profile and weapons load. The carrier controlled engagement geometry, deciding whether to close range for attack, maintain surveillance from standoff distance, or withdraw to avoid confrontation. Soviet ships reacted to carrier movements but couldn't force engagement on their terms. Confrontations between Kirov-class battlecruisers and American carrier battle groups occurred regularly throughout the 1980s, particularly in the Norwegian Sea, where Soviet Northern Fleet vessels operated near NATO sea lanes. Every encounter followed similar patterns that demonstrated systematic American advantages. Norwegian sea operations in the 1980s saw Soviet Kirov-class battlecruisers patrol regularly, demonstrating Soviet naval presence and testing NATO responses. American and NATO forces shadowed every movement. P-3, Orion maritime patrol aircraft tracked Kirov vessels continuously from standoff ranges. Carrier-based F-14 Tomcats maintained visual and radar contact, photographing Soviet ships and monitoring their activities. British and Norwegian forces contributed surveillance, creating comprehensive tracking that left Soviet vessels with no operational surprise. NATO exercises simulated engagements against Kirov-class vessels, testing tactics and validating capabilities. The simulations consistently demonstrated that carrier aircraft could launch strikes from ranges exceeding 400 miles, destroying or mission-killing Kirov before the Soviet vessel could launch effective counterattacks. The exercises weren't theoretical speculation. They used actual sensor performance data, missile engagement envelopes, and aircraft combat radius calculations. The results were definitive. Carrier aviation controlled engagements at ranges where surface ships couldn't respond effectively. Soviet limitations became apparent through operational analysis. Kirov's 20 SS-N-19 missiles represented its entire offensive capability against surface targets. Once those missiles were expended, the battlecruiser had no reloads and couldn't re-engage without returning to port. Compare this to a carrier air wing with 80-plus aircraft, each capable of multiple sorties per day, carrying various weapons, and retargetable in flight, based on changing tactical situations. The carrier's offensive capability was effectively unlimited during sustained operations, while Kirov's was strictly finite. The SA-N-6 surface-to-air missile system provided 65-mile engagement range, impressive for surface ship air defense, but insufficient against carrier aviation. F-14 Tomcats armed with AIM-54 Phoenix missiles engaged targets beyond 100 miles, outranging Kirov's defenses. F-A-18 Hornets carrying AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles launched from 60-plus miles, also outside SA-N-6 envelope. Even if Kirov detected approaching aircraft early, the geometry favored the attackers. Aircraft launched weapons from outside defensive range, then turned away while missiles guided independently to target. Submarine threats posed existential danger to Kirov-class vessels, American Los Angeles-class attack submarines trailed Soviet surface combatants continuously, undetected by Soviet anti-submarine warfare systems. In war scenarios, these submarines would launch Mark 48 torpedoes from close range, sinking Kirov before surface engagement began. The torpedoes, 50,000-pound warheads, and sophisticated guidance systems made kills highly probable. Soviet anti-submarine capabilities, centered on K-27 helicopters and hull-mounted sonar, couldn't reliably detect American submarines operating in sprint and drift mode with sophisticated sound-dampening technology. Electronic warfare created another asymmetric advantage. SA-6B Prowler aircraft carried powerful jamming systems that could blind Soviet radars across multiple frequency bands simultaneously. Kirov's fire control radars, necessary for guiding SA-N-6 missiles to targets, became ineffective when jammed. The battlecruiser's offensive targeting radars similarly suffered degraded performance. Without radar guidance, Soviet missiles couldn't engage effectively. Meanwhile, American aircraft used multiple sensor types: radar, infrared, visual, electronic support measures, providing redundancy that Soviet jamming couldn't fully counter. Kirov's radar systems were powerful, but represented single points of failure. The battlecruiser's primary search and tracking radars provided impressive performance under ideal conditions, but if damaged or jammed, the entire vessel's combat effectiveness degraded catastrophically. American carrier battle groups employed multiple radar types across multiple platforms: E-2C Hawkeye airborne early warning radar, Aegis SPY-1, phased arrays on cruisers, fighter radars on F-14s and FA-18s, surface search radars on destroyers. Redundancy meant that losing any single sensor didn't cripple the battle group's situational awareness. Support ship disparities highlighted operational realities. Kirov-class vessels operated alone or with minimal escorts during peacetime patrols. Wartime doctrine called for surface action groups, but exercises revealed coordination problems and the fact that escort vessels added capability, but didn't fundamentally change the engagement mathematics. American carriers never operated alone. The battle group concept meant 12+ ships working together, providing mutual defense, redundant capabilities, and overwhelming combined firepower. Resupply requirements favored American operational flexibility. Kirov's nuclear propulsion eliminated refueling needs, but the battlecruiser still required ammunition, food, spare parts, and other consumables. Soviet logistics trains were adequate but couldn't match American underway replenishment capability. American carrier battle groups included dedicated replenishment ships that could transfer fuel, ammunition, and supplies while underway, allowing continuous operations for months. The logistical advantage meant American forces sustained higher operational tempos. Mediterranean confrontations illustrated the asymmetry clearly. American carriers transited the Mediterranean regularly, conducting operations near Libya, supporting Middle East contingencies, and demonstrating power projection. Soviet Kirov-class battlecruiser Slava observed these operations, maintaining surveillance but unable to meaningfully contest American activities. Carriers launched aircraft for strikes, exercises, and patrols. Kirov could only watch from standoff range, outmatched by carrier aviation's flexibility and reach. The Black Sea Fleet faced additional constraints. The Montreux Convention restricted warship passage through the Turkish Straits, limiting Soviet ability to reinforce Mediterranean forces with additional heavy units, while American carriers operated globally without geographic restrictions. The fundamental reasons Kirov-class battlecruisers couldn't threaten American carriers were systematic, not circumstantial. Each Soviet limitation corresponded to an American advantage that doctrine and technology combined to exploit. The range problem was absolute. Kirov's SS-N-19 missiles achieved 340-mile range under optimal conditions. High-altitude flight profile, known target location, clear weather, functioning targeting data. American carrier aircraft operated at 400 to 600 miles, depending on mission and weapons. F-14 Tomcats armed with AIM-54 Phoenix missiles interdicted threats at 100+ miles. A-6 intruders carrying Harpoon missiles struck from 60+ miles. The carrier controlled engagement range, choosing whether to close for attack or maintain standoff surveillance. Kirov reacted to carrier decisions, but couldn't force engagement on favorable terms. Detection asymmetry multiplied the range advantage. Kirov's surface search radar detected targets at ranges limited by radar horizon, approximately 20 to 25 miles for surface vessels, depending on conditions. The battlecruiser could detect aircraft at greater ranges if they flew at altitude, but low-flying strike aircraft exploiting radar horizon effects remained invisible until close range. American carrier E-2C Hawkeye aircraft orbited at 25,000 feet with powerful radar that detected surface vessels at 300+ miles. The Hawkeye's altitude extended radar horizon far beyond what surface-based radars could achieve. American commanders knew Kirov's location continuously, while Kirov operated with incomplete or outdated information about carrier positions. Survivability represented existential difference. Kirov was a single high-value unit. Sink the battlecruiser and the mission failed, the investment was lost, and Soviet naval power suffered strategic setback. American carrier battlegroups distributed capability across 12+ ships. Losing an escort was serious, but didn't destroy the battlegroup's combat effectiveness. The carrier itself, while the most valuable unit, operated behind multiple defensive layers and rarely faced direct threat. Redundancy and distributed capability meant American battlegroups survived degraded performance through battle damage, while Kirov's single-ship design created catastrophic vulnerability. Air defense limitations doomed Kirov's defensive concept. 96 SA-N-6 missiles sounded impressive in specifications, but consider the engagement mathematics. A carrier launches 80 aircraft in a coordinated strike. Each aircraft carries multiple weapons: Harpoon missiles, Maverick missiles, bombs. The total number of incoming threats exceeds 200. Kirov's 96 missiles must engage aerial targets, incoming missiles, and potentially hostile submarines. Defensive missiles require guidance radars that can track limited numbers of targets simultaneously. Even with perfect performance, Kirov's defenses would be overwhelmed by saturation attacks that carrier aviation specialized in delivering. The absence of organic air cover was Kirov's fatal weakness. The battlecruiser carried 3 Ka-27 helicopters optimized for anti-submarine warfare, not air defense or strike operations. These helicopters couldn't engage enemy aircraft, couldn't provide combat air patrol, and couldn't extend defensive envelopes beyond missile range. Compare this to a carrier's 90 aircraft that provided continuous combat air patrol, long-range interception, electronic warfare support, early warning, and overwhelming strike capability. Aviation's flexibility, retargeting in flight, coordinating multi-axis attacks, providing reconnaissance, and operating continuously over extended periods, was inherently superior to fixed missile batteries with finite ammunition. Technology gaps undermined Soviet systems' theoretical performance. Kirov-class vessels incorporated 1970s Soviet military technology, vacuum tubes in some systems, less reliable electronics, guidance systems that required frequent calibration and maintenance. American 1980s carrier technology featured digital systems, solid-state electronics, automated fire control, and integrated combat management systems. Reliability differences meant American weapons performed closer to theoretical specifications, while Soviet weapons suffered higher failure rates under operational conditions. Doctrine obsolescence condemned Kirov before commissioning. The battlecruiser was designed to fight 1970s carrier defenses, limited surface-to-air missile capabilities, shorter-range interceptors, less sophisticated radar systems. By the time Kirov-class vessels entered service in the 1980s, American carriers deployed Aegis cruisers, F-14 Tomcats with Phoenix missiles, improved electronic warfare capabilities, and tactics that exploited every technological advantage. Soviet doctrine assumed saturation attacks would overwhelm defenses designed to engage small numbers of threats. American defenses were specifically optimized to handle mass raids, with tracking capability for hundreds of targets and engagement capability against dozens simultaneously. Soviet testing revealed problems that propaganda concealed. A 1980s exercise saw Kirov-class vessels fire SS-N-19 missiles at drone targets in controlled conditions. Hit rates approached 60% against stationary targets with known locations and no defensive countermeasures. Compare this to American carrier defenses that achieved 90% plus intercept rates against incoming missiles in exercises. The mathematics were devastating. Kirov's offensive capability would be largely negated by carrier defenses, while carrier offensive capability would overwhelm Kirov's defenses. Cost-effectiveness analysis highlighted strategic failure. One Kirov-class battlecruiser cost billions of rubles and represented massive industrial investment. One American carrier battle group cost more. The carrier alone exceeded $4 billion in 1980s dollars, with escorts and aircraft adding billions more. However, the carrier battle group provided vastly more capability: sustained strike operations, power projection, sea control, amphibious support, and flexibility to respond to multiple contingencies simultaneously. The battlecruiser provided single mission capability, threatening surface vessels, with limited effectiveness even in its specialized role. The legacy of the Kirov-class program illustrates the trajectory of Soviet naval ambitions. 4 vessels were built. Kirov later renamed Admiral Ushakov, Frunze becoming Admiral Lazarev, Kalinin renamed Admiral Nakimov, and Yuri Andropov commissioned as Pyotr Veliky. Post-Cold War economic collapse devastated the Russian Navy's ability to maintain these expensive vessels. 3 were decommissioned or placed in long-term reserve with uncertain reactivation prospects. Only Pyotr Veliky remains in active service, operating on limited deployment schedules due to maintenance costs and availability of trained crews. The battlecruisers represented the Soviet Navy's peak capability, the largest surface combatants they produced, incorporating the most advanced technology available to Soviet designers, embodying Admiral Gorshkov's vision of surface ships that could challenge American carriers. Yet even at their peak, they were outmatched by carrier aviation that controlled engagement ranges and overwhelmed Soviet capabilities through systematic advantages in detection, strike power, defensive depth, and operational flexibility. American carriers continued their dominance in every conflict after the Cold War: the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Carriers launched strikes that achieved strategic effects while remaining invulnerable to enemy counterattacks. No surface ship has ever seriously threatened carrier battle groups in actual combat. The theoretical vulnerabilities that Soviet planners hoped to exploit never materialized in operational reality because carrier aviation's advantages in range, flexibility, and concentrated firepower proved overwhelming. Soviet and Russian post-Cold War assessments acknowledge realities that propaganda concealed during the Cold War. Russian admirals admitted in interviews and professional publications that Kirov-class vessels couldn't defeat American carrier battle groups in realistic engagement scenarios. The battlecruisers were built partly for prestige, demonstrating Soviet naval power and competing with American supercarriers symbolically even when practical combat effectiveness was questionable. The massive investment yielded impressive specifications, but failed to produce operational advantages that doctrine promised. Modern Russian naval development abandoned the battlecruiser concept. Current procurement focuses on submarines, cruise missiles, and smaller surface combatants optimized for coastal defense and limited power projection. No new heavy surface combatants are planned. The resources required to build and operate vessels like Kirov-class battlecruisers exceed what Russia's post-Cold War economy can sustain, particularly given questionable combat effectiveness against modern naval aviation. China, observing Soviet failures, chose different paths. Chinese naval development in the 21st century emphasizes aircraft carriers rather than battle cruisers. China commissioned 2 carriers, Liaoning and Shandong, and is building additional vessels including the Type 003 carrier with electromagnetic catapults. Chinese naval planners learned the lesson that Soviet admirals discovered too late. Aviation dominates naval warfare, and surface vessels without organic air cover cannot compete against carrier battle groups regardless of size or armament. The aircraft carrier remains the dominant capital ship 75 years after World War II validated naval aviation's supremacy over battleship-centric fleets. Every attempt to challenge carrier dominance through missile-armed surface combatants has failed. Soviet Kirov-class battlecruisers represented the most serious attempt. Largest vessels, most advanced technology available, doctrine specifically tailored to counter carriers. They failed because aviation's inherent advantages, range, flexibility, striking power, reconnaissance capability, cannot be overcome by surface platforms, limited by radar horizon and finite missile loads. The Soviet Union built Kirov-class battlecruisers to challenge American carrier dominance. 28,000 tons of steel, nuclear power, hundreds of missiles, impressive specifications that generated propaganda value and showcased Soviet industrial capability. But specifications don't determine combat outcomes. Operational capability does. American carrier battlegroups controlled engagements from 400 miles away, launching 80 aircraft while Kirov could only fire 20 missiles once, then face hours of vulnerability while attempting to reload at sea or return to port. The gap wasn't firepower measured in missile counts or warhead yields. The gap was flexible aviation versus rigid missiles, retargetable strikes versus pre-planned salvos, and carrier task forces that controlled every confrontation before it began. Kirov-class battlecruisers were designed to saturate carrier defenses through overwhelming missile attacks. American carriers simply refused to allow Soviet ships to close to firing range, maintaining surveillance from beyond Soviet reach, and demonstrating daily that surface combatants without organic aviation were obsolete, regardless of size or armament. Soviet admirals wanted to believe that missile technology had made carriers vulnerable. American carrier battlegroups proved during every Cold War confrontation that aviation's advantages, established during World War II and refined over 4 decades, remained absolute. Kirov-class battlecruisers were impressive vessels that represented enormous investment and sophisticated engineering. They were also obsolete before they sailed, designed to fight battles that carrier aviation had already made impossible.